Okay, you all good? Let's do it. Hello and welcome to the B2C Lead Generation Podcast.
You're listening to the B2C Lead Gen Podcast. My name is Daniel Hopewell here with Simon Delaney, and this is episode 73. Verification is a necessity, not a luxury. That phrase, Simon, verification is a necessity, not a luxury. I'm sort of paraphrasing something you sent me on Slack, I think yesterday. And we'll dig into that kind of, the ideas we kind of talked to this podcast, but ultimately it comes down to the idea that people think of it as maybe not something that is absolutely vital. It's kind of like a nice thing to have, or something like that. Like, why is it vital? Let's begin with that.
Well, verification serves the absolute most fundamental component of lead generation, which is this a real person that I can contact? That's why it's so important, because without that, it's, what's the point?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to understand the sort of nuances in verification and where it happens, where it's needed, why it is, and how verification sort of changes depending on how you're collecting leads as well.
Well, I mean, verification is essentially a solution. So let's start with the problem. I think the term problem is almost a little bit too abstract because, well, for two reasons. One, people don't know they've got a problem, or they don't really fully appreciate how big the problem is. I think that's particularly true when it comes to kind of fraud and verification, this kind of area. So let's start with that. Like, how big a problem is it we need to solve? Let's begin with that.
It sort of breaks down into two areas, and it depends on where you are in the lead generation chain. But let's start from the beginning. So imagine that we're a company generating leads and we're firing leads via Facebook or affiliates or PPC, whatever, that all have different levels of bad leads within them. But what you'd normally do is put verification on the front end of the form, right? So what you're looking for is typically, is this person's postal address right if you're collecting that? Is this person's email address contactable? And is this person's telephone number contactable? What happens is this falls into two categories. So one is mistyped details, which is huge constantly. All it needs is one digit being wrong or one letter not being contained in the email address that might have like 25 characters anyway, and you can't contact that individual. So that lead effectively becomes dead at that point. So you have verification almost as a prompt to a user to let them know, that telephone number is not right, or it's wrong, or, you need to enter a different email address. So it's from that perspective, it's almost like the only way you can ascertain how effective that is would be to record the sessions that people entered, because you don't know how many people go back and correct their details and whatever else. Because when you put this stuff on the form, the likelihood is that you're going to get less bad leads anyway, right? So a lot of the time you don't necessarily know how effective it is or not. All you know is that you're giving every lead the best possible chance to be a real person and have contactable details. Now, once that front-end lead generation process has taken place and the lead's been collected and it's now going off to a buyer, the buyer has to verify the lead, because they don't actually know whether it's been verified in the front end or not if they're not collecting the lead. They can take people's word for it and, I've got verification on the front end and whatever else. But what if they haven't? What if it's been switched off for the day? What if there's something wrong with it? What if actually they've sent you something else? So to give you an example, I've bought billions of leads over the years, right? I don't even know how many, a lot. And we used to verify, and I still suggest people to do this now, every single lead and every component of every lead that we ever bought, because we wanted to remove any chance that person wasn't real or wasn't contactable, because both just destroy the whole lead generation process, either one of those. So I'd always just verify it as part of the lead buying process as well. Now, within this, there are lots of nuances that come into play. So this is stuff like, let's imagine that you're filling a form in with a mobile number, your cell phone number, you're putting your cell phone number in, and you're doing a live lookup on there of that person's telephone number and deciding whether you're going to accept it or reject it on the form. Now, what if that mobile number is out of network at that moment, or they've just switched it off, or something? They're on a desktop and they've just switched their phone off. What do you do? What would you do?
I thought this was a rhetorical question.
No, well, it was. No, I switched it into a real question. What would you do?
Well, in that scenario, I'm not aware of it, so I would miss it surely if I know that. Do you know what I mean? It's being verified, and that lookup software would be.
No, but the lookup software is telling you that this phone is switched off. It's non-contactable.
Oh, she tells you it's switched off.
Yeah, or it's out of network. You know, like they can't. You wouldn't be able to ring it at that moment.
So what do you get? Do you get a notification saying, like it's not off, and you just call back later?
Yeah, so if you run mobile verification, you get, let's say in the UK with most networks, you get like, it's live, it's dead, or it's switched off or out of network?
I don't know, just put a note to ring back at a later point as soon as they're kind of the answer we will deal with, whether or not.
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that you have to like contend with. So how do you deal with it? So some people actually reject that lead on the entry point. Now, if like me,
why would they reject it? Sorry,
they can't contact it.
But they wouldn't think, okay, they're out of network, but I'll put a little note or something saying to call back or automate that to call back in an hour.
Some people do. Some people might reject it. I mean, the way I handle it, and just to give you the way we sort of like the default settings that we have in Databall, for example, is that if someone entered their mobile number and it happened to be out of network or switched off, you can actually toggle this, but we'd allow the lead to go through, but then we retry it 3 times over a certain number of hours to see whether it switches on, and only at that point does the lead get delivered. Because over, I think it was a 16-hour period, if that mobile number or cell phone number doesn't switch back on, there's only a 7% chance it ever will.
So essentially, just bring it back to you asked me, it takes away the need for me to worry about it and to think I've got to write that note and go back to it or manually do it. It sort of prevents that kind of.
But it's just a thing, right? Like, what do you do in that scenario? Like, I'm filling a form in. The only number I've got is a mobile number, and I can't fill my mobile number in on this form.
Oh, you mean as if I was submitting it? You're saying?
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought I took this to mean if I was receiving the lead.
No, if you were submitting the lead onto a form.
Okay, I've entirely missed your question. I thought you meant if I was thinking about it from the lead buyer perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm filling the form in and I can't get, I just go somewhere else. Yeah.
And this is the thing. So these are the like little nuances that happen. What happens if the API goes down that's actually doing the lookup against the like whatever service you use? It could be Twilio or Infobip, whatever, or I don't know, Validity for email addresses. It happens, right? I mean, we see this shit all the time. Like the APIs go down. What do you do in that scenario? Do you suddenly not allow a user to put a number in because you can't verify it, or do you allow them to put it in and go through? And what you'd actually switch to is like a syntax checker of the number of digits that had been entered and whether it matches like the country that they're in. There's all these like weird little nuances. The moment you start driving a lot of leads and buying a lot of leads and everything else that you start really digging into. It's a bit like landline numbers in the UK, for example. The verification that runs on those isn't like binary. So my point behind this is that very few of these verification pieces are binary. It's not like turn it on, turn it off. You actually have to think how it's going to be applied. So just going back to what I was saying, the landline verification in the UK is based on probability. So it's the probability of this number potentially being live or potentially being dead. And then there's all different API responses within that. There might be 60, 70 different API responses that you then need to figure out. It comes with default settings, but these things change. And so, we've had like scenarios where we found out on an ad that a user can't enter a telephone number because this one response that's being given that would normally look like it should be 100% dead is actually like, I don't know, it's changed. The lookup has changed in some way. And you have the same thing with addresses. Last week, I went for a meeting, a 2-hour meeting, and we literally sat talking about address lookups for 2 hours and how it varies in countries and how people in different countries enter their postal addresses and how that might change when a person from that country lives in the UK, for example. And how all this has to be dealt with in different ways so that you're not necessarily rejecting people's addresses just based on the way that they potentially type their address in things, and why the nuances of like the address lookup has to do all this like fuzzy matching within that. And so really, like this verification stuff is a bit like people, and that's why it's sort of like, you know, like a real person that's contactable. Like there's no sort of right or wrong other than, you know, there's no like binary on off. This is about creating a scenario that gives you the best chance possible of confirming this is a real person that you are able to contact. And this all just like, you know, reaffirms this point of why it's so important.
I think it's something you raised. I wrote a little note because I thought it was a really interesting way of looking at this, and maybe something I've not thought of in this perspective, or maybe not worded like this before. I think you think of verification as something to prevent bad data entering your system, and you spent wasting money on that. But actually, what you've sort of flagged there is equally as important to ensure that good data does enter your system that may not have otherwise. I think that's really crucial.
Exactly. And on that, I don't know how many years ago is this now? 10, 11 years ago. I sat in a room with 3 other people and got the census from the UK census from 1916 up until that point, which was I think 2011 or 2012. Got every name out of it, and we used to run data that come in as leads against like thousands and thousands of names, and we'd flag anything that wasn't on that census. So it's like a new name, right? And then what we used to do is like literally look through that data, and we'd pick out any Mickey Mouse stuff that was obvious. Then we'd go through like a vowel and consonant checker and start to look at what names make sense with like a certain number of consonants in a row in the UK. But this is a weird thing, it changes per country. And then what we'd do is when leads went over to our clients for stuff that we couldn't like make a decision about, do you like the name Precious? It's like, you know, it's not necessarily common in somewhere like Thailand or Japan, but they can, you know, or even in some African countries, they might use the word precious. It'd be very unusual for like a person born in the UK to potentially be called Precious, but it is a name. But you get a lead with the thing Precious on it, and you're looking through all these different things, and you're like, is that a real person? Like you almost start to like second guess whether you're able to sort of like determine what a person's name would be anymore. And my point of this is that people's names can be all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and you can have leads. So we put like salacious names checker in, you know, and then it's like, okay, is it if the word is contained in the name? So just for example, the word Scunthorpe is not someone's name, but it's a place. Or is it if it's just definitely that name or someone's famous name? So I don't know, Clint Eastwood is highly unlikely someone's going to be called Clint Eastwood, but how famous do you go?
Yeah, at what point?
Yeah. Do you know, like what point does this sort of person's fame then start to cross into, well, that's also like a name that someone might use?
Yeah. Or for example, like, you know, I love the idea that there's just a bloke somewhere who's got loads of money who just happened to be called Harry Potter, who's like submitting leads all the time. He's like, fuck's sake, I can't get insurance. Yeah.
I used to go to school. I used to go to school with someone called Joe King. I mean, that's how bad it is.
Oh,
like
really?
you would never, yeah. And he used to go, "I'm Joe King," and they go, "Oh yeah, yeah, what's your real name?"
Like, I've spent years trying to get quotes on this stuff, just not happening.
Yeah, but so there's all these like weird little like fluctuations the minute you really start digging beneath it, and I think coming to your point is really, really important. It's like, you know, you want to be able to just contact real people, and it's not just about keeping the bad ones out. It's also about letting the good ones in and making sure that you don't sort of create too stringent a rule to potentially reject them, but at the same time, make sure that you're contacting them. But at its very fundamental, basic level, going back to the thing that we mentioned right at the top, verification is all about, is this a real person that I can contact? And that's it, because that's all lead generation is. It's like it literally underpins it to some degree.
Yeah, and like you said, just to come back to the title of the podcast, I think is a nice way to sort of conclude this. I mean, we've talked, I'm sure we mentioned it on the podcast before, but I'll say it again, maybe people listening new, that number, 35%, it's like a rough number we say of leads we see, either fraudulent or out of spec or suitable, but like basically people are spending money and they've not got verification on, they're losing potentially 35% of they're chucking that money away. And that seems mental. Like when you think of it like that, like that's just a huge amount. But what my question is, are people either not aware of the problem, not aware of this number, so they don't know they need to solve it, or do they almost accept that as kind of like spillage, for want of a better term, thinking like, you know, well, this is no good, we're going to lose some money, but we're going to get 65% great leads and we can sell it. Like, why is it treated like a luxury and not a necessity, I suppose is the question.
I think silage might be a better word than spillage.
Yeah, I can think of it as silage.
I don't even know what silage means, but it sounds filthy. It's just some sort of waste matter from farms, isn't it? But I think potentially it's a bit of both. So I wouldn't say that companies necessarily always see it as a luxury. Some definitely, you know, see the necessity in it. But I think there's two things in this. So one is they don't necessarily see it being that big of a problem. And you can virtually guarantee when they don't see it being that big of a problem is because their conversion rates are at a point where it's hitting ROI on leads they buy, right? So you probably would think that, but that doesn't mean that it's not a problem. That just means that you're able to convert leads that might be experiencing that problem at such a high rate that, you know, you're sort of ignoring the rest of them. But classic example is, you know, let's say I'm collecting leads in the front end and they're going into a call center and I'm just APIing it into a dialer and there's no verification taking place. And I'm able to contact 60% of those leads. That's a normal rate, right? Like they call it DMC. So I speak to 60% of decision maker contacts. And some of those will be right or wrong. Like might be a small percentage. I didn't ever fill a form in, or, you know, you might not be able to dial a number or the email address is wrong or whatever. Let's imagine there's no verification at all. But the real question is, what about the other 40% that you couldn't contact? Like that's nearly half the leads. Yeah. And we like no one even knows whether they're contactable or not because no one's getting hold of them anyway. So I think that's probably what it comes down to, is just whether your conversion rates are high enough. I think if you're a brand buying lead, it's potentially seen as more important because you really want to get rid of like any potential pollution of your database and the like costs that can have of feeding it into sales teams. You know, the marketing costs of putting all this stuff together. If like 35% of all your efforts are basically wasted, it's like, what the, you know, it's absolutely pointless. But yeah, I think that's it. It's just, you know, do the conversion rates add up to a decent ROI? If they do, we can sort of ignore it.
Interesting way of thinking about it, but you know, whether you think about removing the bad data from it or ensuring the good data is in there, it all comes down to sort of streamlining your database, removing your kind of, I think, bloated marketing database is a kind of nice way of, you know, I think we've worded it before. Yeah, hopefully people listening will have, I don't know if I'd say switch from thinking it's a luxury to a necessity, but hopefully we've really hammered home that point that it is a necessity. It is a huge problem and can massively, it's a relatively simple solution to massively improving your performance. So yeah, I think it was worth doing a podcast on verification alone, because although we talk about it a lot, we've not actually really dived deep into it. So hopefully we've done that and that was of use. Just looking at the title here, episode 73. I think it's probably worth bringing it back around to something we were discussing before, Simon. So I'll put put you on pressure so you think without any preparation, but we're thinking about changing the name of the podcast. Like we said, BT Lead Generation, we literally called it that because we have the wrong sort of approach. We want people to be able to search it. But I think we've got past a point now where we're going to have to, well, not rely on it, but we've accepted that's a bad name for a podcast. It's very, very boring.
It's not the most
it's not
enticing name, is it? Yeah.
So rather than just us decide, one, we'll put it out there and try and get responses. We were toying with some different ideas. The winning one at the moment, although we've not decided upon it, but the highest vote at the moment is the Data Orchestra. We thought it was pretty cool, and obviously works well with the idea of moving data around, whether B2C or B2B, and like things like verification, data going in, data going out, and all the things in between. It seems to fit quite well and got quite cool.
I think B2C lead gen, the name was just a bit like Ron Seal, wasn't it? It was just like,
yeah, exactly.
Does what it says on the tin, and we just went, let's just go with it. But yeah, in terms of an actual like podcast name, it's not, no one's going to be doing anything untoward to themselves at night over it. I know I'm not.
just to clarify, is that the reaction you want?
Well, yeah, ideally.
Oh, that's a horrifying thing. Okay, that was episode 73 of the B2C Lead Gen podcast. For now, maybe one of the last few of that. Verification is a necessity, not a luxury.
Thanks for listening to the B2C Lead Generation podcast. Be sure to hit subscribe to hear more from those at the very cutting edge of the lead gen world.